Anyway, a warm welcome and particularly special to have a launch event for a new biography of Dylan Thomas. That is indeed a special occasion, especially when it's by Professor John Goodby. And I got your name right this time. I slipped the slip of the tongue earlier on, but special welcome to John Goodby for the chat this evening on the basis of his new biography of Dylan Thomas. It is really an exciting. I've read the book. I can honestly say that I have. And we're going to split the evening up into two parts, part one and part two. There we go. That's all you need to know. Now, we're going to split the evening up into two parts. Part one, I'll have a chat with John about specifically Dylan's link with his house and some of the influences that he might have picked up in the 20 years or so that he was living here with mum and dad, and for a lot of the time with his sister as well. And then in part two, we'll talk more a little about the themes and why John saw it fit to go ahead and write the book in the first place. But on top of that, we will also be hearing some poetry because we are very keen in the Birthplace to still nurture poets from all over. And we have a very good poet here this evening, indeed, somebody who grew up round the corner to this place and who remembers coming to play here as a little girl. Not when Dylan was here, though.
No.
I thought I had to slip that one in just in case. Yeah, so we're going to start the part one with Laura Sheldon. Laura's a poet, been writing professionally since about 2014. Is that correct? Yeah. A teacher and writes books for children and has had her own book launch here about 10 years ago. So before we have a chat with John, we're going to hear some poetry from Laura. Give it a warm welcome.
Thank you, Alan. It's so lovely to be back here. Like Alan said, I think you invited me because of my geographical relevance.
No, we don't only invite people who are just born around the corner. No, strangely.
When I was a little girl, I lived on Hillside Crescent, which is just the next street up. And from my bedroom, which was a front little box room, I could see the back of this house. It didn't have a blue plaque and it wasn't like this then. But a little while later, friends of mine came to run it as a bed and breakfast. So we did actually come and play in here. I remember it being very dark.
Oh, right.
That's all I remember. But
These kittens probably.
well, I'm going to share one of Dylan's poems with you first, and this is The Hunchback in the Park, which Alan asked me to read, but actually, I'm really glad you did because it's so relevant. Every time I come back here, I don't live locally anymore, and when I come home, those memories of playing in Cumdonkin Park as a child are really visceral, come straight back to me. So, in preparation for tonight, I listened to Dylan Thomas reading The Hunchback in the Park, resurrected him, and he introduces it as here's a little poem of mine. Nothing very much about anything, gets a laugh, but it sounds partly especially the third stanza, almost like a song, and it's a lovely way to start the evening. The Hunchback in the Park. The hunchback in the park, a solitary mister, propped between trees and water, from the opening of the garden lock that lets the trees and water enter until the Sunday sombre bell at dawn. Eating bread from a newspaper, drinking water from the chained cup that the children filled with gravel in the fountain basin where I sailed my ship, slept at night in a dog kennel, but nobody chained him up. Like the park birds, he came early. Like the water, he sat down. And Mister, they called. Hey, Mister, the truant boys from the town. Running when he heard them clearly, on out of sound, past lake and rockery, laughing when he shook his paper, hunchbacked in mockery through the loud zoo of the willow groves, dodging the park keeper with his stick that picked up leaves, and the old dog sleeper, alone between nurses and swans, while the boys among willows made the tigers jump out of their eyes to roar on the rockery stones, and the groves were blue with sailors, made all day until bell time, a woman figure without fault, straight as a young elm, straight and tall from his crooked bones, that she might stand in the night after the locks and chains, all night in the unmade park, after the railings and shrubberies, the birds, the grass, the trees, the lake, and the wild boys, innocent as strawberries, had followed the hunchback to his kennel in the dark. I'd like to read a couple of my own from a little pamphlet that I made in collaboration with an artist friend of mine, because following on the theme of nostalgia for childhood, I've got two boys who are on the cusp of adulthood, and I have a nostalgia for their childhood. So I'm going to share a poem for each of my boys, if that's okay.
Carry on.
But it's very small print.
Ah.
This one is, if any of us here are parents, might relate to that feeling of the title, which is "He Can't Hear Me." And this is for Tom. He can't hear me. I watch him ramble through the kitchen, leaving open cupboards, empty packets, crumbs and spillages in his wake, and he talks about a game I can't pretend to care about. He's telling me in detail, and the thread of the story makes haphazard stitches in my mind. But the light from the open door falls on his still, smooth cheek, and the down on his brow, now 6 foot in the air, is just like the hair on his newborn head. I say, clear up after yourself. Leave something for the rest of us. For God's sake, eat something with a vitamin. He picks me up off my feet because he can, and eye rolls with his whole body as though to say, I know, you've told me 1,000 times. My words that reach his ears, mild with reminders, instructions, nags, are mundane dust covers for countless momentary gut punches, an untamed limbic love, fierce as wildfire, gorging on a grief for something I haven't yet lost, and it's good. It's right that he can't hear me. And then just before I pass on, this is one for Charlie, otherwise it wouldn't be fair.
Of course.
Okay. Charlie's my 17-year-old, and both my boys are surfers, which is a terrifying thing for a mother. No, it is. It's not good. This is a pantun, which is a style of, it's an old Malaysian style of poetry where you repeat the first and the third line as the of the first stanza as the second and the fourth line of the first stanza as the first and the third of the next, and so on. But you change the meaning slightly as you go through the poem, so hopefully it makes sense. This is going back to when Charlie was a little boy and it's called Ducks and Jugs. He used to have ducks and jugs in the bath. Now his toys are hard fiberglass in deep water, and he seems so far out that I can't reach to stroke the back of his neck. His toys are hard fiberglass in deep water that pulls or propels him senselessly, and waves reach out to stroke the back of his neck, with all the inevitability of the moon that pulls or propels him senselessly to forge a fresh satellite path. With all the inevitability of the moon, his orbit silently shifts. And though he forges a fresh satellite path, he turns, and his smile meets my eye. I know his orbit silently shifts, but still see him circling ducks and jugs in the bath.
Thank you so much. We celebrate Dylan's poetry in the place where he's born, and we also like to encourage current poets as well to share their poetry with us. And now, here we go. Please give a warm welcome to John Goodby. You've already said more than once, so I have, that this is the place where Dylan was born, and he was born here in October 1914. Now, obviously, too young to appreciate the fact that there was a World War beginning. But is that very beginning, the date in which he was born, has that got any bearing on his attitude, on his work in later life?
It has, Alan. Yeah, very strong one, I think. And I'd just like to say before I begin, thanks to you and thanks to Jeff and to everybody else involved in setting this
Thank you.
this event up. It's great to be here. It's a long time since I was in the house.
Yeah.
I go back to Swansea every year or so, but it's the first time for quite a few years. So it's great to be here. And to go to your question, yes, as I said, I think the First World War, which started 6 weeks before he was born, had a huge impact on his poetry. I mean, his father wasn't recruited. DJ didn't go off to fight. They're relatively cushioned from the war.
Yeah.
And later from events, the catastrophic events like the great crash, the Wall Street crash in 1929. DJ didn't lose his job, but Dylan was aware, like every member of his generation, of older brothers, uncles, fathers who had gone off to fight and had come back wounded, maimed, or not come back at all, and that it had been an immense carnage, a catastrophe, and not much had come from it, except in the early 30s, rising militarism in the world, and in Germany particularly, the rise of Nazism. And all of that preyed on Dylan, and it's there in the early poetry. And if we take poems, some of the earliest ones he wrote, as a mature writer, when he was very early as a mature writer, when he was 19, 20, like I Dream My Genesis, they refer directly to barbed wire, to gas, trenches, bodies exposed in no man's land, and so on. And so there's a pervasive imagery of World War One and of another world war looming. So they run through that early poetry like Blackpool through a stick of rock.
Yeah. So right from the very beginning, there is that huge influence of something that he was actually unaware of as a newborn in October 1914, but which pervaded his work. He was obsessed with death. He does deal a lot with death. Does that come from there?
I think it's also from it does, but I think it's also a product of you're growing up, you're an adolescent, you start
Yeah.
thinking about the concerns of adulthood, and they frighten you at first. You don't know how to deal with sex, you don't know how to deal with death, but these are the things you're beginning to face as you mature. Your body's changing, your mind's changing, your desires are changing, and your fears are changing as well. So that concern with death is part of the fear of war that's in Dylan's poetry. I think it's also part of his Welshness, and I've got to be very careful how I put this forward, I suppose.
I'm listening. I'm listening.
You're listening, yeah. You've got to stick behind your chair there, have you? There's a sort of Gothic strain, let's say, in Welsh literature and Welsh character, even.
Hymns in the minor key.
You got it in one, absolutely. And I think that darkness, the repression perhaps as well that goes with a certain kind of nonconformist identity. There's a repression of sexuality and emotions and so on. That can feed into this Gothic sense and an awareness of mortality, because that's there in the intense religious fervour of Wales too. Prepare to meet thy doom, prepare to meet thy maker. That's part of the Welsh experience. So he tries to weave that in without actually writing specifically religious poetry. But this is one of the things that distinguishes Dylan's poetry beyond other poets of his age at that date. You don't usually expect 19 and 20-year-olds to be obsessed with death, but I think his specific Welshness, that ethos that he came out of, gave him that. and it acts as an intensifier in his poetry, which you don't find in other English poets, let's say, of that period.
Yeah. No, you're safe with that. Okay. Yeah.
Next.
Yeah, the influence of the time in which he was born, but of course, a big influence on him growing up within these walls is the influence of his parents. And you've already mentioned the dad, DJ. He was 37 when Dylan was born, so that's probably one reason why he never went to war. He was probably too old for conscription. Yeah, but anyway, and they were very different people, Florrie and DJ, mum and dad. Tell us about that difference.
Okay, I suspect you know more about it than me, but you know,
My book's out next week, by the way.
DJ was a kind of academic monkey, wasn't he? He was a sort of spoiled lecturer, as it were. He wanted to be a university don, really, and he had the intellectual ability to have been one. He got the only first in English in the University of Wales in 1900. He went to University Aberystwyth. He was a scholarship boy. He'd come up from a working class background. He had the wherewithal to make it. It's said that he applied to be the first chair of English in the new university in Swansea in 1920, but didn't get it. So he nurtured that kind of intellectual ambition. He was very widely read. He had a library of his own in that middle room there. And he had ambitions, I think, at one time to have written himself. So he was an intellectual, let's say. Whereas Florrie was an intelligent woman, but not one who read books. She was a storyteller. She was a homemaker. She was warm. She was the person who kept in contact with the relatives, the neighbours, built up networks, had people into the house. DJ was rather forbidding in character, from what I can tell. He was rather cold in his manner, although Dylan obviously loved him. He was at a bit of a distance, and he used to withdraw into that room when he came back from work, or go out with his mates drinking, and not have much time to spend with the family. So temperamentally different, intellectually different. I don't make too much of it in the book, because there is this kind of trope that you find in a lot of authors, books about authors, biographies of authors. It's there with Dylan, with D.H. Lawrence particularly. You've got the proletarian, working class, energetic parent, and you've got the middle class, intellectual parent, and it's a little bit of a cliche, you know. So I try to play it down a little bit
because in effect, in practice, throughout the 20 years that Dylan would have lived here, they both actually encouraged him. So it's not fair to set one against the other, because they might have done so in their own different ways, and they did, because they were completely different people. But they both, in the end, encouraged him in his endeavours.
That's right, yeah. And I think the role of his sister, Nancy, should be emphasised here as well. Nancy was 8 years older than Dylan, divided by age, they're divided by sex and all the rest of it. But she was a bit of a trailblazer for him. Yeah. She was good at English at school as well. She joined the Swansea Little Theatre before Dylan, and he, in some ways, followed in her footsteps. And she was interested in literature too. So, there's that influence in the family as well. And just because Florrie didn't read books, it didn't mean she stopped Dylan doing it. And in fact, as you say, both of them encouraged him to write poetry, which he did from this very early age, from about, he says, 7.5 onwards. And why disbelieve that? We've got examples of him writing when he's 9 and 10, very good imitations, really, of verse of the time. And he's become a practiced kind of imitator, really, somebody who can send his verses off to Robert Graves, no less, when he's 14, and have Robert Graves write back and say, these verses are impeccable. They're not your own voice. You will learn to write better, but, I can't fault them as they are. Yeah. So, that was what his parents helped him produce. Of course, DJ had a major input because he let Dylan roam his library. He read Shakespeare to him, apparently, when he was a child and couldn't even understand it. Read poetry to him in the cradle, this kind of thing. And he let him have the run of his library. I think that was the main thing. Yeah. But at the same time, Florrie took him to chapel. And when Dylan's asked about his main, influences, he talks about the influence of the Bible and of Welsh sermons, of going to the Paraclete Chapel on Sunday, to hear his uncle preach, and the rhythms of the Welsh preaching waving over him. And that's a major influence on his poetry as well. So, okay, Dad provides Shakespeare, but Mum's providing the Bible. So
there's sister brought the theatre.
And the sister brings the theatre, yeah.
You mentioned that the father, that's me.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the father reading to Dylan. Florrie actually, in an interview after Dylan passed away, I think refers to that and says that she remembered her husband reading Shakespeare to Dylan in the study, the room next door to us here, when Dylan was 4 years old. Now that's a little bit heavy, a little bit serious for a dad, and how many have that experience that you're reading Shakespeare to your son at 4, and also Dickens and stories from the Bible. Now I'm fascinated by that period, because let's take that 4 as coming from his mum, and then he didn't start school until 7 years old when he started in the school down the road here. So between 4 and 7, he was hearing Dickens, Shakespeare, and the Bible before he was going to school. In that period, I'm fascinated by trying to unravel that. It's a space for the imagination more than anything else. I'm wondering what it was like for Dylan to actually go through that and how that formed him. He learned, I would think personally, the sound of words before their meaning.
Yeah, I mean, that's what he says, isn't it? In his, I think it's called the Poetic Manifesto. It's a bit less than a manifesto. It's an interview with a student, I think, of University of Texas from 1950, where he tries to describe this pre-linguistic love of language. And I think it's a crucial admission. I mean, obviously, he's kind of justifying his practice as well. He's 37 years old. He's, it's partly a sort of justification of what he'd already done. And I include part of that in my edition of the poems because I think it's very important. It's as an appendix, but it's here in the biography as well. If I could just find it, it's in the first chapter, so it's not far away. I wanted to write poetry in the beginning because I had fallen in love with words. The first poems I knew were nursery rhymes, and before I could read them for myself, I'd come to love just the words of them, the words alone. What the words stood for, symbolized, or meant was of very secondary importance. What mattered was the sound of them, which is what you're saying, Alan, as I heard them from the first time on the lips of the remote and incomprehensible grown-ups who seemed for some reason to be living in my world. And these words were to me as the notes of bells, the sounds of musical instruments, the noises of wind and sea and rain, the rattle of milk carts, the clopping of hooves on cobbles, the fingering of branches on a window pane, might be to someone deaf from birth who has miraculously found his hearing. And then he goes on to say, I did not care what the words meant, or who Jack was, or who Jill was, or why they fell down the hill. I cared for the shapes of sounds that their names and the words describing their actions made in my ears. I cared for the colours the words cast on my eyes. I fell in love. That is the only expression I can think of at once. So this is him saying that before he could understand the words, and possibly before he could even speak, he was in love with words, with language. And we might say, well, that's all poets, that's all poetry, isn't it? But actually, if you look at most lyric poetry, it's usually lamenting the limitations of words, often, of what words can't do. They can only do so much. Words alone are certain good, Yeats said. And Eliot talks about, the fracturing of language and so on. But Dylan doesn't do that. For Dylan, language isn't a fall from this kind of infantile bliss. It's a reconstitution of it. It's as though language takes him back to that fullness of existence that he had as an infant. So in that sense, I think he's a very different poet to most of the the modernists, the big modernist poets that we know of, Eliot, Yeats, and so on. And maybe that comes from this particular indoctrination almost that you're talking about by his father. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, I am intrigued by that 4 to 7 period
Mm.
in
That's crucial, isn't
his
it?
life.
Give us a child until he's 7, and we'll
Yeah,
show you the man.
yeah. I'm going to have to move on. There's so many other highlights of the 20 years plus that he was living in this house with his mum and dad. He obviously went through so many different stages of life in such a long period. But I'll end on the theme of the fact that he got his first works published when he was here, and his serious poetry and notebook poems. Over 200 poems in
Mm,
5 notebooks
mm,
Dylan wrote while he lived here. And they consider the first volume of poems that Dylan had published consist of the poems that come from the notebooks,
mm,
which means in effect that his first volume was work done by a teenager,
mm.
which is another thing which is quite remarkable and often overlooked in Dylan's story as well. Um, but that was a significant step for him to get those works published as a teenager from the far west town of Swansea.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, he's immensely precocious. And if you look at the notebooks, and I've been over to America and I've studied them, and with Aid Osborne, who's here today, I'm glad to say, we edited the 5th notebook. Um, this is the last one, which he kept between the ages of, I think, 20 and 21, the last in the series. But they began when he was 15 and a half in
Yeah.
1930. And actually, the first, 3 years of those notebooks are pretty undistinguished. They're good, for a 15, 16, 17-year old. And there are one or two poems that he would later rework and publish. And those are very good. But it's not until April 1933, when he writes Death Shall Have No Dominion, that you get a sense that he's grasped the potential, the style, the process style that it's as it's called, that he's going to become famous with, become a great poet by. And it's interesting. It's the first poem to be published in a national journal, the New English Weekly, I think it was, in May of 1933. And it's interesting because he wrote it in competition with Bert Trick, his friend.
Yeah.
He's a local Labour Party councillor. And it stands out in the notebook poems because it's one of the very few, up until that point, where he's got regular rhyme and stanza forms. Because up until then, he's been thinking, I'm a modernist. I just write free verse. I don't write. I'm like Ezra Pound. I'm like Eliot. That kind. But he's forced because he's in this competition with Bert Trick to write the best poem on the subject of immortality. It's a little game they're playing. That he comes up with this. Why does he write in that way? Why does he revert to this old-fashioned rhyming stanza form poems? One poem rather. And I think it's partly because, it's Bert. He likes this kind of poem. I'm going to do a kind of, you know, a pastiche
It's his
almost.
peer. Yeah.
And then, he writes this poem. He thinks, what's happened? I spent 3 years training to be a modernist poet. I've just produced this kind of archaic thing in a competition with my friend, and it's the best poem I've ever done. What's happened here? I sent it off to London. It's being published. What's going on? So you see in the notebooks the next few months, he's going back to his free verse. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to be a modernist. I'm going to continue on my path, but slowly realizing that it's the compression that the traditional forms and half rhymes give him that are bringing out the best in him as a poet and are creating him as this new kind of poet, process poet. And over the summer of 1933, you see him, I'll go back and try another one in stanzas. And so it goes on. And then by September of 1933, with the 4th notebook, it begins in early September 1933, he's writing Before I Knocked uh, and 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 yes, left end. He's writing the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. He's writing Light Breaks Where No Sun Shines. All these great poems that will go into his first collection. So he's cracked it by almost regressing to a more traditional verse style, and that's the paradox, I think, of the style. He had to get through that kind of modernist period before he could find in the notebooks this kind of Back to the Future sort of style, which is what made him a great poet.
But it's a prolific output, isn't it? Over 200 poems in that.
It just shows how much. Uh, think of it as being like a gold mine. Think of how much ore and slag has to be thrown up to get
Yeah,
those
the
few
nuggets.
ounces of gold. Yeah, and this is the remarkable thing for years really, and as a teen as well. He was doing the hard work. He was unconsciously and in the dark trying to move towards a style that would be a new lyric style, new style of lyric poetry, and the faith and the endurance that you need, to do that when you don't really know where you're going is incredible, I think. So he's a very disciplined writer.
Yeah, well, that is evident if you look at his work, but that's
Yeah.
contrary again to public perception, and we
Exactly.
can pick that up in the second half.
Yeah.
Whereas I tell people here when you do the tours, I say that he was very disciplined, and people quite often visibly
Yeah.
look at me and say, "What did you say? He was disciplined." I said, "Yeah, he was."
Mm.
But okay, there are so many more things to get. We'll bring that first part to an end here. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
We'll have a 15-minute break, but for which you can go and have a look at John's book out there, buy some refreshments as well. Please do so. And then in part two, we'll hear more from Laura, and we'll continue our chat with John. Thank you very much. Great, that, John.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. It's just, as I say, it's too much to say, as you know.
I'm chomping at the bit. You're saying something, and I think, oh, there's a little rabbit hole I can
Yeah,
can't. There's so much. How we could concentrate just in the house. And, yeah, but second half was harder because it's so many. It's more diverse. And
yes.
once he's left this house, only 16 years till he dies.
But yeah, we do the rest of the life now. Yeah.
It is a stark contrast to the first part of his life in this house, though. The second part.
I think so. Yeah, here he's kind of held, he's enclosed, and he's protected.
Oh. He might have been Jack the Lad, but it was always within the confines.
Yeah.
There was a boundary for Jack the Lad, wasn't there?
Yeah. Somebody drew those lines.
Yeah.
You have to stagger back up the hill and go to bed.
You could freewheel down here on a bike to the end of the hill. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I think he did that once though. Broke a bone or two.
Yeah, on the wall. And
Block 11. Is that right?
We done, John? Yeah.
Sorry.
Same again, Laura first, and then.
Yes.
Right, well, welcome back to everybody here in the parlour, and welcome back to everybody who's joining us on Zoom as well. We're going to start the second part, the same way we started the first, with Laura reading one of Dylan's poems and another poem of her own as well. So let's welcome Laura back.
Thank you. I wanted to share this poem called Being But Men, because I'm going back to the sort of the childhood nostalgia really, and I think it's woven through much of Dylan Thomas's work. But in this poem, it's about the perception of childhood and what you lose as you grow. And I think there's something very poignant about it. Being but men. Being but men, we walked into the trees, afraid, letting our syllables be soft, for fear of waking the rooks, for fear of coming noiselessly into a world of wings and cries. If we were children, we might climb, catch the rooks sleeping and break no twig, and, after the soft ascent, thrust out our heads above the branches to wonder at the unfailing stars. Out of confusion, as the way is, and the wonder that man knows, out of the chaos would come bliss. That then is loveliness, we said. Children in wonder, watching the stars is the aim and the end. Being but men, we walked into the trees.
Mm.
And my last poem I'm going to share with you today is also about perception. This is a poem I wrote about. There's a very common Welsh myth that if you go to sleep on a certain mountain, as every mountain claims it as their own, you wake up either mad or a poet. There's Mynydd Carningli, this is particularly about, which is in the Preseli Hills. And this is about the story of Brynach, who came over and fell asleep on the mountain and then was visited by angels, or Ingli, in his sleep, and received these prophecies and became a prophet, a saint. And the idea, I think, of perception and how and lies and mistruths and faith and how we build our reality was quite intriguing for me. So this is called Mynydd Carningli. Actually, there's one more thing I'm going to tell you, is that the reason that I became so interested in this was a friend of mine, and he was telling me about the dream man of Carningli. And I thought, is there somewhere I can go and find a dream man? Brilliant. But actually, it's a man who was literally collecting people's dreams.
I like it.
Close my bubble. He would invite people to fall asleep on Carningli, watch for the REM, and then wake them up. Wouldn't be too happy about. And then write down their dreams to see if there was any prophecy coming through in these dreams. And I thought, what a wonderful, wild idea, and that amount of faith, I think, is wonderful. So make what you will of this. Mynydd Carningli. Wild camp with me on the summit of Carningli, where the angels will speak to us in our sleep and drive us mad, or prophetic. We'll tell each other tales to make skylarks trill over their remains, hovering like markers above cairns and ghost circles. Play giants with me over forests of reindeer moss, spreading with glorious hubris over blockfields, scree making mini worlds of real. We'll wait for our breath to catch us at the capstone by the wishing well and ruminate about whispers that have rested against its blue face. If the dream man comes to collect our revelations, we'll laugh and play cynics and say, we're just here for the views, and they will stretch in sweet conspiracy over Newport Beach and smile placidly over a tundra of hidden truths. Then we'll be still, under wraiths of myths and murmurations, until time loses shape and we feel like we could fall through strata and merge with hot earth, our blood like lava, and you will be next to me lying and saying, we fit. This is us. And there, just in that moment, it will be true. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much. Thank you. Yes, John is back in the chair. And just to say, at the end of this second part, we will be having a question and answer. So kind of flagging it up now so you can think in those terms, especially maybe for those of you on Zoom. If you do have a question, if you put it in the chat room and send it, and Jeff can read out any if I haven't asked him yet, but I'm sure he will. If you want to ask a question and you're not actually in the room. Thank you very much. Yes, John, we're back again. You have handed out some
I have
leaflets.
just
Break out.
little strips. For my sins, I have to collect information, if I can, about the talks I'm giving on Dylan Thomas this year. For something called a possible impact study, and it's to do with something called the research exercise. I won't go into any of the sordid details, but basically my university wants some kind of proof that people's attitudes to Dylan have been changed, or maybe not changed, by what I've been saying around the
Wow.
country. So wherever I go, I give out these slips and I ask people if they wouldn't mind just putting down a few words. You could say good, bad, rubbish, but mainly it is did I change your opinion, your ideas about Dylan in any way? There's an email address at the bottom if you want to do it, at a later date, because you may not have a pen or the will. So I have to give feedback now. So leave it at that. And thank you very much, Edmund Babs, for anything you can give me.
Great. Interesting. Right. Well, we started at the beginning with in part one with Dylan being born here. Beginning at the beginning seems to have a Dylan precedent. Now, with yourself, to begin at the beginning, why did you feel it necessary to have another biography
Good question,
of
isn't it?
Dylan?
Yeah, because there are several, and some of them are very, very good. Um, I suppose it's because, first of all, personally, in the 25 years, let's say, that I've been working on Dylan Thomas, I've shied away from the life. I felt that the life distracts
Right.
too much, too often, from the poems themselves. So my books on Dylan, it was a collection of essays in 2001, and then I did a program to go with the Imperial War Museum DVD of his films in 2006, and those book in 2013, collected poems 2014, etc., etc. These other things. I focused on the book. Play the ball, not the man. That's been my attitude. Yeah, focus on the works. But I felt, after so long, it was time to maybe just look a little bit more at the life. And I got the opportunity because Reaction Books, who do this series, Critical Lives, uh, they more or less asked, we needed Dylan Thomas title, would you do it? So I got together with Chris Wigginton, who's a former PhD student of mine back in 2000 or so, and he agreed to be a kind of co-partner, and we wrote it. It had a difficult birth, like a lot of the births in Dylan's poems, because it was just pre-COVID when we signed the contract, and then everything you know about with COVID kicked in. I got a serious illness myself midway through. I had to have an operation, so that slowed things down. Chris's mum died, alas, um, and so it's dragged out for about 4 or 5 years. But I think it's better for that. Um, and I know I'm deviating slightly here, but it was the hardest thing I've ever had to write, and I was the main writer of it. I have to say, Chris provided some many, many, many valuable inputs, but I was the main writer, and it was hard because I'm an academic, and you have to write straightforwardly, unpretentiously, without fancy theorizing in a book of this kind for this series. So I had to do that, and that was very tough. And I think all of that contributes to what makes the book slightly different to the others. Um, there are other, as I've said, there are other biographies much longer than this, much more detailed. There's Fitzgibbons from the mid 60s. He knew Dylan, he's the only biographer who knew Dylan and got to write about him. There's Paul Ferris, 77, very, very detailed. And then there was Andrew Lycett in 2003, and there are biographies by other people, including my friend Hilly James, The Three Lives of Dylan Thomas, where she does it from the point of view of his friends, the Cardoma gang, and so on. But what they do is you know, whether good or bad or ugly, they tell you about the life. And the poems are these things he did over there.
Right.
Yeah. So what I was trying to do was write a biography through the works. What did Dylan think his life was about? He thought it was about his short stories, his poems. He'd have given everything else away if he knew he was going to be remembered for what he had written. He was a writer, through and through. So the thing that mattered most to him were his works. So let's approach the life through the poems, let's say, rather than approach the poems through the life. That's the basic difference.
That fascinates me because I find it difficult to warm to a person who writes, poet or otherwise, unless I know a lot about them. So you never. That's maybe why I'm not an academic. In fact, it probably definitely is why I'm not. Um, but throughout that period when you were doing your academic work, never tempted, or I'd like to know more about this part of his life. I'd like to know more about that, more about this. It was purely what's down on the written page.
Well, you can't avoid it, Alan, and I relish the anecdotes as much as anyone. And I went in search of them, and I read all the biographers that I've mentioned and enjoyed them. I think they have their drawbacks, and I'll say something about those if you like. But I just think it's a disservice to Dylan to focus too much on the legend. Let's put it like that.
Yeah.
There is a life there, but there's a huge legend around it which obfuscates and confuses, turns him either into a boozy fraud or a sentimental charlatan. And I think, no, he was a great poet. What we need to do is understand why he was a great poet.
Because what's interesting is probably talking of perception of Dylan,
Mm.
us, everybody here in this room, and everybody who was an interest in Dylan, has their perception of him from books such as yours, the
Mm.
biographies.
Mm.
Now, most of the image of Dylan came after he died. Most of the perception.
Yeah, he was building during his lifetime because he was a legend in his own lunchtime, wasn't he?
Yeah, yeah.
So it was building before then, and his public image was something he worked on. It was like early PR, wasn't it? And his legend preceded him. Certainly, it did it in America. But yeah, it ballooned afterwards.
So what about that perception while he was still alive then? He was very popular with critics, obviously, in America and here, and other poets. When did the public perception break through?
But I'd say the breakthrough moment, when he became a minor national treasure, would be mid 1946.
So Deaths and Entrances.
Well, he just published Deaths and Entrances. I think that came out in February 46. It didn't make him what he became. What really happened then was the BBC,
Right.
because 46 was the major year for his radio broadcasts. Up until then, there had been a sprinkling, a handful, and he'd only written two scripts of his own. The first version of Reminiscences of Childhood, and there was, I think, quite early one morning, which was the predecessor to Under Milk Wood, that was 1944. But in 46, he wrote half a dozen original scripts, and he took part in either as an interviewee or reading in other people's things in around 50 different programs. They just created the light service, I think. Not the light service, the equivalent of Radio 3, I think, and 4. And he was perfect for it, so they used him a lot. Um, and one of his friends said, I went to a reading that Dylan gave at the beginning of 1946, the usual kind of hardened poet friends and so on, and a dozen. And I went to a reading he gave at the end of 1946, and there were, he was fighting them off with a stick. There were young people there. It was packed. He'd also done a royal broadcast in between those two, where he read to, the king and the queen and the young princesses. Um, so he just became, in 1946, through the agency of the BBC, I think, a public figure. And people then went back to the poetry and the stories, and they discovered him, and that began to snowball then in the late 40s.
Was that a public figure as part of an establishment, in an establishment kind of way?
I think he became partly accepted in that way. I mean, he was put on things like the Brains Trust, I think, and he did Cheltenham Literary Festival, things like that, and the Eisteddfod, and he was sent out to do various, reporting of the Festival of Britain, for example, 1941. He wrote a piece for the BBC. So he was being trusted with stuff,
Yeah.
but not as a kind of, the BBC treated him quite shabbily in a way, I think. They never put him on a permanent contract, and they, towards the end, they would pay him, per page virtually, or per word, and he complained about the unequal treatment he got. He wasn't bitter, but he pointed it out. McNeice is being paid 4 times as much for doing this equivalent amount of work to what I'd been paid. So, he was put in that position of being able to make a living acting out that persona on radio, let's say, but it was a costly one. He had to work very hard to make a living, and we know he didn't really until he went to America, uh, and in America. He was lionized. It was quite the opposite of the hard work he'd had to do to keep his head above water in the UK.
Yeah, well, I mean,
And in America, it all took off.
yeah, absolutely, and that's where the phrase falls back to, even though it was before the beginning of rock and roll, that this was the rock and roll poet. Even though rock and roll hadn't actually started properly in 50, 51, 52, 53. Is that a fair title to give him?
as a kind of precursor of rock and roll, a sort of yeah.
Because it goes against the tradition. The guy is part of the establishment, and then
Mm.
there's rock and roll, and he gets both titles.
One of the things about Dylan's life and career, although he died in 1939 and it was quite a sad and sordid end, is that he seemed to be almost always in the right place at the right time. So in the early 30s, he's articulating the fears of the Depression, the rise of Nazism, the fear of war. In the Blitz and in the war years, he is writing great poems about the civilian suffering, the deaths of people, innocents during the Blitz. Um, in the late 1940s, he's writing poems about the nuclear threat. That's his final sequence, in Country Heaven. And when he went to America, he just happened to be this rumpled Dionysian figure, spouting with immense confidence fantastic sounding poetry at a time of cultural cringe and fear because of the McCarthyite, witch hunts that were taking place. And so liberal America sort of looked to him almost as a sort of savior. Here's a man who's actually, expressing free spirits that we've had crushed, who, goes about in this, law breaking almost maverick sort of way. So they loved him, they lionized him, they lived through him vicariously in a way. Um, and, through their hospitality,
Yeah.
beat him with devastating consequences, perhaps we could say.
Yeah. I was going to come on to that as part of not just the 18 Straight Whiskies. I think
Mm.
it's a record phrase of his, but more the fact that when he went to America, particularly, he came face to face with something that he would not have been used to. Certainly, having spent 20 odd years in this house in this area of Swansea
Mm.
at that period, which was fame, celebrity,
Mm.
or whatever version of that, because it was unheard of for a poet. I would have thought so. Tell me if I'm wrong. To have that degree of adulation.
Well, Byron woke up and found he was famous in 1816. It had happened before, and poets are often national icons, you know, in countries in Europe have been, or in other parts of the world as well, Latin America, for example, cultures which prize poetry highly. So I wouldn't say it's totally unprecedented,
No.
but the circumstances of that period and that time, the Cold
Yeah.
War, the McCarthyite witch hunts, Dylan being who he was,
And Dylan having no precedent for knowing how to cope with
yeah,
that.
in the English-speaking world, yeah, and in the 20th century, there's probably no phenomenon, like that of a poet actually conquering uh, a country, America, in that way. And as you say, okay, did he know how to handle fame? Well, he'd been a very lionized poet in his small circle when he went to London. He wasn't unknown. He had his admirers and his followers. And when he came back to Swansea, in the late 30s, there'd be all the young poets and literary people crowding around him. He was the centre of attention in, Fitzrovia and in the pubs and the dives and the clubs
Yeah.
in the 40s. He used to hold court. They'd go out from the BBC, do the session, and they'd have a session in the pub, and he'd be surrounded by his acolytes.
Mm.
And he had too many of them. They were hangers-on, and people who pushed another pint at him and said, "Tell us another story, deal." So he had a certain amount of fame before he went to America, but I think you're right in the sense that it wasn't on that level. It wasn't as huge as that.
And I suppose it was in stark contrast as well in his own personal experience to the quiet suburban life here
Oh yeah,
with mum and dad and his sister,
totally.
and then to be exposed to the full glare of
Mm.
publicity and adulation.
Which he didn't like, I don't think.
Probably didn't. Yeah.
No, I think he could deal with it up to a point and perhaps enjoy it to a limited extent. But basically, he's quite a shy person, I think, deep down. Um, and was inclined to be ironic and sardonic even about the amount. He called his followers in America his ardents. It's a put down phrase. He didn't necessarily want this attention. Um, yeah, I think we can focus too much on the American years. You know, he
Yeah.
said, "I'm a voice on wheels. You know, I'm doing it for money. I'm just an old ham." He performed. He wanted to try and take back as much of the dollars as he could. That didn't always work out the way it was planned. But yeah, he went from reading, even at the best gig in London, 70, 100 people, to filling halls with 1,000, at every American university he went to. And if you look at the tour he did, the tours, especially in 50 and 53, I quote in the book, you look at the itinerary, and he was looked after on the East Coast by Brennan to a certain extent, but then he was just put on a train with some tickets and said, "You've got to do these, this, and this, and this," and then get some more tickets in San Francisco, fly to Florida, and so on. Doing it all himself. He'd had no kind of agent with him or PA or people accompanying him. As somebody's pointed out, it would have killed an athlete in the prime of life, let alone a sort of raddled 37-year-old overweight poet. So how he handled it, I think he only ever missed one performance in America, despite all the stories. He missed a lot of the parties because he didn't particularly want to go to those, but he always did the gigs. And how he managed that, I don't know. But again, it's part of that professionalism that people don't credit enough, I think.
Yeah, well, it's that discipline is a word that we don't usually associate that we've heard tonight, and shy is another one
Mm.
that he was.
Well, and this takes me back to what I do in the book, I suppose, and me and Chris do in the book. We try to bring out aspects of Dylan that aren't emphasised, but are there in the poetry.
Is that because they're not in the other
Yeah,
biographies?
I think it is, and I have every respect for Lycett and Ferris and Fitzgibbon, but they do fail him in certain ways. I think they succumb to the legend a little bit too much. Let's just take the childhood aspect that we were talking about earlier. I think there are two aspects to Dylan's talking about his childhood. One of them was the obvious one, the one that you've been talking about so far, the childhood of Return Journey, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog, Fern Hill, um, the Hunchback in the Park, poem Laura. But the other one, and which is to me in some ways more interesting, is the way that the early poems are about childhood in the sense of conception, um, of growing in the womb, of birth, of acquiring language. They're about genesis of the individual and of the universe. And those really powerful early poems, I use, unfortunately, because this is where I lapse into academic ease at one point, I use the word ontogenesis, origin of being. And that's what these poems are about. And that's why they're so powerful. They're a kind of personal mythology which he forged in order to create himself as a poet, but also create the Anglo-Welsh lyric. There was nothing in Welsh poetry before Dylan in the English language which could stand up to anything really in English literature. So vast and complex and amazingly impressive structure on its own in 1930. And along comes Dylan, and he has to invent the Anglo-Welsh lyric. If he's going to be good, he's got to do it on his own terms. So that's what he did, and it's about the creation of the self. That's why there are all these poems about, embryos, about conception, about birth, and they seem mystifying to us. But it's Dylan delving into the science of the time. Again, people don't give him credit for this, but the process philosophy, you might call it, of his early poems is influenced by Darwin, Einstein, Freud, and those poems ask questions about the appearance of the actual world. They're about the fact that modern physics has told us this is 1930 after all. We have the general theory of relativity. This table, this book, is more empty space than atoms. What does that say about appearances? That they are completely deceptive. What does Freud tell us about the human subject? He tells us that most of it we don't know about. It's the id, it's the unconscious. So Dylan factors all of that into his poetry. That's why these things are about the mystery of existence and origin. And he makes incredible, playful, often metaphors out of that. So in a poem like A Saint About to Fall, he's speaking in the voice of the sperm as it's about to sort of leap and be ejaculated into the womb, and he takes it from there. And then the embryo grows inside the mother, and then the mother's voice takes over, and then the child is born into this world of war and burning brains, as he puts it, because the poem is written in 1938, just after Munich. So this is Dylan. He's got this cosmic vision, and this is another way of looking at childhood, isn't it? On the one hand, he's got these lovely reminiscences of a almost perfect, happy childhood, but on the other hand, it's about the angst about where do we come from, how do we create ourselves, what is it to have the burden of manufacturing this literary tradition on his shoulders, and that's what those early poems are about, which is why I personally think people should read them, and not just cherry pick, not just because I like Fernhill, and I love Hunchback in the Park, but I think we should read things like, Before I Knocked and Flesh Let Enter, and I Dreamed by Genesis, and so on. And these early poems, I See the Boys of Summer. What's that about? Fears of war, fears of growing up, the terror of existence.
Fascinating. There's a lot to think about there. We're coming to the Q&A fairly soon, so if you want to get your brains thinking. Yeah, there are so many things. I want to go down so many, but I can't. Whoa. And I suppose to ask that question that brings us right to the end of his life. He died at 39 years of age, which was ridiculously young. And he produced so many good works during that short life. But just that what if kind of scenario, what would we have had if he hadn't died at 39?
Yeah, it's a $64,000 question, really, isn't it? Impossible to answer.
There was one project he was specifically
Yeah. He was working on an opera with Stravinsky, which was to be a kind of follow-up to the Rake's Progress, for which W.H. Auden had written a libretto, and Stravinsky had written that, and it had been performed, and Dylan had heard it and liked it. And of course, he was over the moon when Stravinsky contacted him and said, "I want you to write my next libretto." And it was to be about, and this goes back to Dylan articulating the fears of the time. It was about a world which would be wiped out by nuclear war. There's two survivors, a girl and a boy, and they had to sort of rename the universe and recreate it. So we're going back to those subjects of the early poems again as well. And it was going to be that kind of new creation myth, basically. That was what they planned. So I think that kind of thing.
Was he heading in that kind of direction? Because Under Milk Wood was a digression from what he'd done previously. That was a digression. Was he looking for something new to do?
Yeah, I always wonder how much he wanted to write Under Milk Wood, and
Okay.
do you know what I mean? He had to put bread on the table, didn't he? He had to make money, and I think the success of Under Milk Wood would have made him try to write other pieces in the same vein. I do, yeah. He would probably have finished his overarching poetic project in Country Heaven, which, as he said himself, it contains um, some of the long final poems he wrote, like In Country's Sleep, um, Over Sir John's Hill, um, In the White Giant's Thigh. These magnificent long poems, and he said that they were the again. He imagined that the world had been annihilated in a nuclear apocalypse, and that these were the memories of the spirits of people of Earth looking down on the planet, trying to imagine that past. So I think he would have completed that poem cycle. Um, would he have done other things? I don't know. It's
That's
very
what I'm
difficult to
guessing.
tell.
Yeah.
I think because he was so good at the media, that's the media. He just made two television programs. Um, uh, they've been lost to posterity. But he was great with the radio. He'd written film scripts. He's very versatile. He would probably have done more work with the media. He may even have been, who knows, a TV presenter.
Yeah.
He'd have been very good at that, I think. So he would have had to find ways of making money, is what I'm saying. And they wouldn't necessarily have involved poetry, which was what he really, really wanted to write most of the time, I think. So it would probably be a fairly mixed bag. It probably would have been interesting. It probably wouldn't have been as great as the great early poetry, but it would have still been very, very readable.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate that. Give a big thank you to John Goodby. And as I said, anybody with some questions that they'd like to ask, there's one on Zoom. And let's take that one first then. Thanks, Jack.
This is from Josh Brown.
Right.
I remember launched his book about Dylan about 9 months ago in this house. And he asked, did Dylan get the idea about storytelling from his mother, who had a reputation as a storyteller among her family and friends?
I'll repeat that so that people on Zoom can know what the question was. It's from Josh Brown. Hello, Josh. Did Dylan get his storytelling from his mother? Yeah. Did Dylan get his storytelling from his mother?
I think there are two parts to this answer. One is that I'm sure he got a lot of his skills, in terms of sociability and being able to make human contact with people from his mother, because his father was pretty useless at it. So he must have got it from somewhere. But on the other side, no, I don't think so. I mean, he's a professional poet. He wrote short stories, however, from very early, from his 17, 18 sort of years period. And he was very, very good at them. I think it naturally went with his evolving poetry. You've mentioned the notebooks, which he wrote, but he kept a notebook with his short stories in as well, and they kind of co-evolve with the poetry. So I think he saw his early short stories as a way of doing things that he couldn't quite bring off in the poetry. They're a bit more explicit. That's what fiction is compared with poetry, lyric poetry. And many lyric poets write short stories. I just think it's part of the territory for lyric poets or poets generally to try their hand, not at novels, because they're too demanding, but short stories, they have a kind of lyric form.
Yeah.
And I think that was why he did it.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Anybody else? Jeff.
Another one from Josh Brown. Would you agree with the late Gwen Watkins that he would have stopped writing poetry because over 20 years he had achieved what he needed from it?
Would you agree with Gwen Watkins that Dylan, over 20 years, would have stopped writing poetry because over 20 years he'd have achieved what he wanted from it?
I think Glenn Watkins is one of the shrewdest critics and analysts that Dylan had, along with Vernon, actually. And she said many true things about Dylan. And I think, going on from what I said in the question before the first one, that your final question, Dylan may have written himself out as a poet, or exhausted what he had to say in 1953 once he'd finished that sequence he was working on. That may well have happened. I suspect he'd have been tempted back into it occasionally, even if he'd had his work cut out writing another On the Milk Wood. But there's a grain of truth in what she said, that the final poems are a kind of culmination of a phase, which may have been the final one. And so, yes, that could have happened, but we don't know. This is one of the great unknowns.
It is the what ifs, isn't it? Yeah. Anybody in the room with a question? Because it's Zoom 2, room 0 at the moment. Yes, we're in the front, then we come back to the Zoom.
There's a lot of connections between Dylan and Alan Lewis, for example. If you take Alan Lewis as, one of the great English Anglo-Welsh writers, when he went to India, he wrote some superb short stories, but just a handful of superb poems, and was definitely writing more short stories at the end of his life. But again, he's somebody else who died before we could find out one way or the other.
Yeah.
So it's not a question, but
it's an observation.
Even younger than Dylan, I think he was only 28.
That's right.
and he's a terrific short story writer, as you say, and he has that kind of expressionist intensity that you find in early Dylan as well. They had a connection because Lynette Roberts was a very close friend
Yeah.
of Alan Lewis, and Lynette Roberts was, uh, living very nearby Larne when the Thomases were there in the first phase, 1938 to 1939 at Larne. And I think Dylan was the best man at her wedding. I had to borrow a suit off Vernon Watkins for the job.
But he turned up at least.
He turned up with his turn-ups because, of course, the trousers are much too
I don't know
long.
whether he gave it back, but
Probably not.
no, I certainly not.
It'd be like a lot of the shirts he borrowed, I think.
Yeah.
So there was that connection, and I think he knew of Alan Lewis's work, and there are connections stylistically as well. But as you say, lyric poets writing short stories, it was a thing to do then. Yeah, I'm not sure whether poets do that the same way now, but it was in the mid 20th century.
Interesting. Yeah, good point.
Are we going back to Zoom? No, David.
So, yeah. Thanks, John. And one thing that I would take away is your injunction to go back and read those early poems. That I would definitely be doing that. But perhaps if I'm being flippant, and I'm going to be obviously, you talked about the birth death thing with in effect, and is there anything else? I suppose is what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Dylan Thomas is the great poet of birth and death, but that's what great poets write about. I mean, I know there are other things in the middle, but really, those are the imponderables.
Yeah, it's a little bit more than that because, as you say, there are things in the middle. So there's birth and death, but there's also sex, love, and faith as well. And he can be a great religious poet as well as a poet of love and of loss of love, of course. I would say, in response to somebody who put that question in a negative way, he only writes about, death and birth and sex occasionally. And I would say that is true, but the real adventure is going on in the language. What is he doing with the language? This is what makes Dylan Thomas's poetry worth reading. He does things with the English language that had never been done before. He is, in effect, he's the Joyce of lyric poetry of that time. And he's influenced by Joyce's Ulysses, but also by Finnegan's Wake. He buys 2 sections of that for himself as a Christmas present, 1933. And we can see him doing Joycean things with the language, bending it. Carl Shapiro said that he bent the iron of English. A great phrase. He bent the iron of English. He bent its syntax. He bent the collocations, the kinds of words he could put together. And I would say that a Dylan Thomas poem is not about a thing as such. It's immerse yourself in the language and follow the adventure of the language and see where he is allowing the language to take him. Because the great thing about Dylan Thomas, I think, is that he will let the language lead him sometimes. He doesn't always have to be in control. His only piece of advice that he reiterates, continually throughout his career, is poetry must come from words, not towards them. Now, most poets say, I'm going to write a poem about the beach. Let's find the words that say what I'm going to say about the beach. Dylan Thomas didn't do that. As Vernon Watkins said, his method was to accumulate a series of things, maybe overheard phrases, maybe something he read, maybe a word that he simply loved for the colour of it. And then he'd watch them, he'd look at them, he'd put them together, he'd rearrange them. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. He'd see how eventually they could fuse and produce a rhythm, a colour, a poem. And the language was leading him. And that's not what most poets do. And that's why the early poems don't have titles. To give a poem a title is to tell you what to think about what you're about to read. He didn't want to do that. It's over to you, dear reader, and it's kind of an arrogance, isn't it? I'm not going to give you any clues, but it's also a kind of trust.
Yeah.
I'm trusting you, the reader, to be clever enough, to be intelligent enough, to be emotionally responsive enough to follow what's going to happen next. Yeah. It's over to you. It's an adventure.
I love that. Is there one there, Jeff?
I've got two.
Oh, no, they're way ahead of you. Come on.
One comes
4-1
all the way
now.
from California.
California from?
Telling them that we're not going to charge you a tariff. John Dodson, another author who's writing a book about Dylan.
Fab.
Any sense that Dylan might have understood how, through his recordings, his voice would have been available to future generations?
John Dodson in the States. Any sense that Dylan would have
Understood how, through his recordings, his voice would have been available.
yes, how did Dylan understand that how through his recordings his voice would have been available to future generations?
That's a good question, I think, isn't it? Because I think I'd say yes and no. I mean, he knew what the effect of his voice was. He cultivated it. He'd had elocution lessons down the road with his sister. He could boom it out, and he knew what the effect of his voice was. The readings he'd given in America, but here as well, and he was, practiced in that kind of thing. So he knew the impact he could make with it. Did he know what the LP as a medium would do with his voice? No, I don't think he did.
No.
He was recorded. I think it was on his second visit to America. I'm not absolutely sure. His second in '52. He was recorded, and he signed a good contract with Caedmon, which would have given him a lot of money if he lived. And those records that he made for Caedmon sold 400,000 copies in 10 years, and they were a major part of his impact in America in the 50s, and they kept his reputation alive for it to be even more boosted during the 60s, because he became a kind of poster boy, didn't he, for rock and roll and film stars in the 60s. So I think, how could you have predicted that? No, it's just such a huge.
He wouldn't have had a concept of.
He wouldn't have. No, I don't think so. No. You come to Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s. The medium is the massage, and he is saying Dylan Thomas is the first bard of the Electric Age, and that's how he could have been viewed at that point because of the reach of those LPs. I think they had a crucial role, and he couldn't have. He'd have loved the royalties, obviously, but they might have solved some of his problems. But I don't think he would have, conceived that the total impact of them.
Great. You said there's one more?
One more from another author, Hilly James.
Hilly James?
Oh, hi, Hilly.
How do you make your students interested in Dylan's work?
How do you make your students interested in Dylan's work?
Another good question.
Hilly James, a daughter of Alfred James, an artist who was one of the Caddo McGann and friends with Dylan.
Well, this is very appropriate because, as you say, Hilly is Fred's daughter, and he was an artist, and Dylan knocked around with painters. One of the ways I would get my students to grasp what's going on in the more difficult poems, let's say, would be to show them visual art, because there's no kind of predecessor in written art for some of those poems. I See the Boys of Summer, but show them a painting by someone like Magritte or Dali or Max Ernst or Arp, semi-surreal paintings which are to do with organic growth, painted in the late 20s and early 30s, these new movements in art after Cubism, and it makes a connection. You can think, oh yeah, he's trying to do in words what some of these painters are trying to do with oil and charcoal and paint, and that would be a way of getting my students interested. That's one example. But also let them listen to Dylan. Yeah. Play, love the words by listening to him recite them, and say, actually, he's not always the best reader of his poems either. Listen to Richard Burton reading some of them.
Yeah,
I must do that. Or I might say, take a Volkswagen advert from 2007, Night Drive, a series that was used to advertise the Golf, where a guy drives dead of night, 3 a.m, probably through downtown LA. I don't know if you've seen this. A beautiful little 1 minute 30-second ad, and the guy is driving through empty streets, past barking Alsatians in scrap yards, cops in all-night cafes, weird tailors' dummies in windows, and he's driving along, and it's LA, and over this is Richard Burton intoning the opening words of Undermilk Wood, and it works amazingly.
Wow.
It works.
Seen that?
It's out there online, so YouTube,
Wow.
and it's well worth a look at. So that would be a way of getting them in, you know.
It's just got me. Fab, thank you so much. Can we, anybody else in the room? Just give you a chance. No, no, that's fine. Thank you so much once again, John.
Thank
Really
you, Alan.
appreciate it. It's good and exciting to know that there is another biography of Dylan Thomas, and now you have a little bit of context from it if you've been able to listen and to share uh, with what John's been saying this evening. And when I think of the book, I've only just got two words to say, really. Buy it.
Yeah. And please fill out the form if you can. But the one plug I didn't get in was that we manage in a footnote anyway, and perhaps stretching a point slightly, to link The Force That Through the Green Fuse Drives the Flower to May the Force Be With You and the Star Wars trilogy. And we wanted to use a Star Wars poster, but of course Disney, who own all the rights to the Star Wars trilogy, asked for us for an astronomical sum. So that is one illustration that is not in the book.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you. Give them back to me, Joe, if you like. That, or just leave them on the door as you rush out, hoping to avoid my, pursuing you because you've written something horrid about me. That's fine. No, that's fine. Thanks. Yeah. I'll look at Q&A sessions.